Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show that's built entirely around your curiosity. We take your sources, the articles, the notes, all that research, and we weave it into one, hopefully concise and entertaining journey.
And today we are tackling one of the biggest missions we've ever seen. It's just so culturally loaded, so vast historically. We are literally uncorking history.
We really are. We're going from the earliest agricultural societies all the way to, the complex neuroscience of the modern buzz, and it's all through the lens of alcohol.
That's the mission. We're tracing how these drinks went from being, well, ancient staples and, believe it or not, highly sought after medieval medicines
Right.
into the diverse global commodities that, shape our economies and our evenings today.
And we are kicking things off with a historical fact that just sounds completely made up. For centuries, the strongest spirits weren't just a beverage.
No, not at all. They were seen literally as the secret to eternal life.
I just love this. The term that anchors this whole belief system is aqua vitae.
Precisely. Aqua vitae. It's Latin, and it means water of life. And this wasn't just, a poetic turn of phrase. It was a radical conclusion that medieval European alchemists drew from a revolutionary new piece of science for them.
And that science was distillation.
That was it. Distillation.
So let's unpack that a little. Why on earth did this specific liquid get a title like water of life? What was so revolutionary?
Well, it was all about its perceived power. I mean, its purity seemed almost magical. Distillation itself was the main technique these alchemists used to purify everything.
Okay.
So just imagine their surprise. They take ordinary wine, this fermented liquid they've known forever, they distill it, sometimes with salt, using this new equipment, a still.
And what comes out the other end is just totally different from anything they've seen before.
Completely. What condenses is this clear, pure liquid ethanol that was highly flammable. Now, Islamic alchemical works had actually recorded this way back in the 9th century. They called it burning water. But to the medieval European mind, a clear liquid that could catch fire like oil, but came from wine, it must have felt divine.
It's like they captured pure energy in a bottle.
Absolutely. But the property that really sealed the deal, the thing that made it aqua vitae, was its ability to act as a kind of universal solvent.
What do you mean by that?
Well, regular water could dissolve sugar. It could dissolve salt. We all know that. This new burning water, though, it could dissolve natural materials that water couldn't even touch.
Things like resins or essential oils.
Exactly. So the alchemists concluded that this purified substance had to be a secret of nature itself, a key to life. And therefore, it was capable of enhancing any curative properties of things it was mixed with.
That context is just so crucial. It gives all distilled spirits this incredibly high-status origin story. But before we get any deeper into aqua vitae, we have to go back. Way back.
Yeah, we need to ground ourselves in the absolute antiquity of alcohol.
Right. Before the purifying fire of distillation, there was just fermentation, a staple woven into the very fabric of early civilization.
And that's such a necessary step to take.
Yeah.
Alcohol wasn't some, innovation for leisure time. It was a central part of early agriculture. The sources are really clear that long before European alchemists were in their labs, fermented drinks were integral to the economy and administration of ancient societies.
We're talking about the civilizations that built the foundations of written history. You just have to look at the Sumerian and Babylonian records. They don't just mention beer, they categorized it.
They did. These records detail specific, codified types: golden beer, dark beer, strained beer.
It's so specific.
The complexity of their records just highlights how vital beer was. This wasn't just some guy brewing in his backyard. We know these were made mostly from barley and emmer, which is an ancient type of wheat. The documents are all about accounting for raw materials.
How much grain goes in, how it's processed, how the final product gets handed out.
Yeah, which strongly suggests that beer was a critical part of their economic ecosystem. It was probably used as rations, maybe even payment, to keep the population stable and, energized. It just goes to show the story of alcohol is inseparable from the story of civilization itself.
Okay, so that really sets the historical stage. Now let's shift gears and get into the fundamental science of it all. Because whether it's an ancient Sumerian brew or a $1,000 bottle of scotch, it all starts with the exact same biological process.
Fermentation.
Fermentation.
The basic science is just so robust and so ancient. Fermentation is a metabolic process, a biological conversion, where airborne yeasts act on some kind of sugar source.
And that sugar could come from pretty much anything, right? Fruit, grains, honey, even tree sap.
Anything with sugar. The yeast consumes that sugar for its own cellular energy. And in doing so, it produces two main byproducts.
And those byproducts are the essence of this whole deep dive: ethanol, which is the alcohol, and carbon dioxide, the gas.
And crucially, this biological magic is an anaerobic process.
Meaning it has to be done without oxygen.
Exactly. If oxygen gets in, the yeast often just switches gears. It moves to aerobic respiration, which is much more efficient, and it oxidizes the sugar completely into just carbon dioxide and water. No alcohol.
So, seal your fermenting liquid, you get booze. Leave it open to the air, and the yeast just lives its normal life, and you don't get what you want.
That's it. That change in the metabolic pathway is actually known as the Pasteur effect, and it's why controlling oxygen is so essential for brewing and winemaking.
The sources outline 3 primary types of fermentation, which is amazing. This one biological function is responsible for a huge part of the food we eat globally.
Starting with the foundation, you've got lactic acid fermentation. This is where specific bacteria and yeast convert sugars into lactic acid. The beautiful thing about this one is that it's anaerobic and needs no external heat.
This process is kind of the silent hero of food preservation everywhere, especially in places without refrigeration. It takes perishable stuff and turns it into staples like sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt.
The foundation of sourdough bread.
Right, it fundamentally changes the texture and preserves the food for months.
Then the second type is our main event today, ethanol or alcohol fermentation. This is where specific yeasts like Saccharomyces cerevisiae break down pyruvate molecules from sugars, and what you get is carbon dioxide and the alcohol we're all here for.
That's our beer, our wine, and the base for every spirit.
And finally, there's acetic acid fermentation. This is more of a two-step process. First, you ferment sugars into alcohol, and then you expose that alcohol to oxygen and a specific bacteria.
Acetobacter.
Right, which converts the ethanol into acetic acid.
This is how you make vinegar. It's basically what happens when you leave a bottle of wine open on the counter for too long.
Exactly. The whole system just shows the subtle control required to get such wildly different results.
So sticking with ethanol fermentation for a minute, we have to talk about the fundamental divide in the beer world.
Ales versus lagers.
For most drinkers, it's just a difference in taste. But scientifically, it's all about temperature and how the yeast behaves.
It is the yeast divide. Ales use what's called top fermenting yeast, which are usually strains of that Saccharomyces cerevisiae we mentioned, and they operate at warmer temperatures.
We're talking like 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit.
Pretty warm. And because of that warmth and the yeast's activity, the fermentation is really vigorous, it's pretty fast, and the yeast literally rises to the surface during the process.
And what does that warmth and speed do for the flavor of the final beer?
It introduces more esters. Those are flavor compounds that are often described as fruity or spicy or just complex. So ales ferment and age pretty quickly, usually within 3 to 5 weeks.
Lagers, on the other hand, are the slow burn specialists.
They're the introverts of the beer world.
Hmm.
Lagers use bottom fermenting yeast, which prefers the cold, usually somewhere between 35 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit.
And that cold temperature just dramatically slows everything down.
It does. The yeast works slowly, and because it's so cold, it settles out at the bottom of the fermentation tank.
This slower, colder process then produces a much cleaner flavor profile, right? With fewer of those complex fruity esters.
Exactly. Lagers require a lot more patience, often taking 6 to 8 weeks to finish. That temperature and where the yeast hangs out, top versus bottom, that is the fundamental classification that defines almost every beer on the planet.
Moving beyond the usual suspects of grain and grapes, the sources highlight the incredible adaptability of this process, especially in Africa, where brewing is often a way to create nutrient-dense food supplements from very local ingredients.
And this is such crucial context. In different parts of Africa, traditional beers and wines are made from maize, millet, bananas, honey, even saps from palm and bamboo trees.
And these drinks serve a dual purpose. They're alcoholic, sure, but they also provide essential nutrients, B vitamins, calories that might be missing from diets that are low in grain.
Yeah, the process for making palm wine in Nigeria is a perfect example of this kind of integrated natural biotechnology.
How does that work?
It starts with tapping the male inflorescence of the oil palm. They make these thin cuts once or twice a day, and this sweet sap just bleeds out. And this raw sap is rich, about 15% sugar.
And here's the genius part. The local bacteria and the natural airborne yeast do all the work automatically.
The sap collects, And almost immediately, it starts to ferment naturally into this milky, slightly flocculent beverage.
Flocculent just means it has little particles or flakes in it, right? You can see the fermentation happening.
Exactly. And the tapping process is sustainable for 2 to 3 months per tree, and you can get about 3.5 liters a day.
Mm.
This whole system creates a continuous supply that's just essential to local economies and cultures.
Okay, so that takes us from these simple fermented staples right into the realm of high-proof power. This is the real pivot point in history. The move from just fermentation to the purification process that gave us aqua vitae.
Distillation is really the deliberate engineering of a spirit. You're concentrating the ethanol that was produced during fermentation by taking advantage of the different boiling points of water and alcohol.
Right. Alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water. So you boil the wine or the fermented mash, the alcohol vaporizes
You
first.
channel that vapor, cool it down, and the purified liquid, the spirit, is collected in the condenser, or the still.
Early alchemists used what was called an alembic still. For them, this wasn't about making a lot of something. It was about ultimate purity.
And as we said, the result, aqua vitae, was initially a purely medical pursuit.
Yeah, the historical goal was to increase life expectancy, to cure illnesses. The whole idea was that distillation captured the essence of the wine and whatever medicinal botanicals they were using.
And that tradition is still with us today. So many modern complex liquors began their lives as these highly respected medicinal waters, often infused with specific herbs.
Just think about the liqueurs and digestives. Chartreuse, with its secret recipe of 130 herbs, was literally invented by French monks as a medicinal elixir.
Cointreau, vermouth, those famously bitter Italian digestives like Amaro, they all trace their lineage straight back to the alchemist's lab, to that pursuit of a universal cure where the distilled spirit was the carrier for potent medicinal plants.
And this line of descent is clearest when we look at whiskey.
Absolutely. The Latin term aqua vitae was translated into Gaelic and Irish as usage betha, or use bethad.
And over centuries, that just got corrupted until it gave us the modern word whiskey.
So if you're drinking scotch or bourbon, you are, in a very real sense, drinking the water of life.
And the first official record we have of Scotch production immediately puts it in this grand, high-status context.
No, absolutely. We look to the Exchequer Rolls of 1494. And this isn't some record of a clandestine home brew. It documents a man named Friar John Core at Lindores Abbey in Fife, receiving 8 bowls of malt by order of the king.
King James IV to make aqua vitae.
Exactly. And 8 bowls of malt, that's a lot. It's about 500 kilograms of raw material.
Wow. And that was enough to make, what, around 400 bottles of spirit? This scale implies something pretty serious is going on. It's not just a casual abbey project.
No. And it was treated like an elite pharmaceutical. King James IV was fascinated by medicine and alchemy. He went on to found an organization that eventually became the Royal College of Surgeons.
And he gave them an exclusive license to produce aqua vitae.
He did, for medical use, including as a powerful antiseptic and, critically, as an early form of anesthetic during surgery. It was truly high-tech medicine for its time.
Okay, so now let's get into a huge myth in the world of Scotch. This idea that it was always meticulously aged for flavor.
That is such a fundamental misunderstanding of the history. For the first couple of centuries, Scottish distillers, they preferred to drink their whiskey fresh off the still.
Meaning it was clear, raw, and probably pretty harsh.
Oh, yeah. Barrels were just for storage. They were purely utilitarian vessels for transport.
And sometimes those vessels were actively disgusting. The source mentions barrels that had previously held things like fish or even hog knuckles.
You can see why flavor wasn't the top priority back then.
So what changed?
The shift that defined modern Scotch aging was a brilliant global supply chain accident that happened in the mid to late 1800s.
An accident.
A huge one. Europe was rocked by a phylloxera epidemic. It was a French wine blight that destroyed vineyards and just wiped out cognac supplies, which was the aristocracy's favorite spirit.
So the European elite needed a replacement, and they turned to Spanish sherry. Sherry consumption just exploded, which meant massive volumes of sherry were being shipped to the UK.
Which led to a huge surplus of empty Spanish sherry barrels just piling up in UK ports.
Yeah.
It was too expensive to ship the empty barrels back to Spain.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Scottish distillers, always looking for a deal, needing cheap storage, scooped up these surplus sherry barrels.
They replaced their foul-smelling old containers, and they soon discovered that the longer the raw whiskey sat in these used sherry-soaked barrels, the smoother it became. The darker, the more complex.
So this happy accident, driven by a French disaster and a Spanish surplus, is what rooted Scotch's identity firmly in its aged, sherry-influenced past.
The rich color, the notes of dried fruit and spice, the smoothness, it all came from this practical, cheap substitution. And it transformed Scotch into a globally desired luxury good.
The entire multi-billion-dollar tradition of Scotch aging is basically rooted in a supply chain failure and a pile of cheap, used Spanish barrels. That is fantastic.
And that transformation is all about chemistry. Aging isn't just passive storage, it's an active chemical process. The wood itself contains compounds like vanillin, which gives you vanilla flavors, and lactones, which give you coconut or woody notes.
And in Scotch, the used sherry wood is providing even more specific compounds.
Right, esters and aldehydes from the sherry, which add complexity and remove the raw spirit's harsh edges through oxidation.
And this accidental aging tradition is in such stark contrast to American whiskey, specifically bourbon, which is governed by these very specific, very strict rules that dictate the flavor from day one.
Bourbon aging is non-negotiable. Legally, bourbon has to be aged in charred, new American white oak barrels.
And that use of new wood means the spirit just sucks the maximum flavor out of the wood immediately.
And that deep char layer on the new oak is absolutely crucial.
How so?
It's both a filter and a flavor agent. The char acts like a charcoal filter, removing sulfur and other harsh compounds. At the same time, the heat exposure breaks down the wood cellulose, allowing all that vanillin and those lactones to be easily extracted by the spirit.
And that's what gives bourbon its signature sweet, deep vanilla and caramel notes so quickly.
Exactly.
So if we start setting the groundwork for our final thought here, when we talk about bourbon, we're talking about grain. Mostly corn grown in specific U.S. soil, aged in specific new American oak.
Right.
In Scotch, it's mostly barley from Scottish soil, aged in used Spanish wood. Even before you distill it, the base material is fundamentally dictated by its location. The terroir is already there.
That's a key distinction. The raw material carries the first stamp of its origin, and the barrel dictates the second.
Our next major spirit takes us across the globe, from the damp cold of Scotland to the tropical, violent heat of the Caribbean. We are diving into the rich and, well, very dark history of rum.
The history of rum is just intrinsically linked to two powerful forces, the growth of sugar and the tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade. But let's start with the name.
The early names were certainly evocative. Kildeddle does not sound like a party drink.
No, and that name really reflects its initial harshness. The word rum itself most likely comes from English slang terms like rumbullion or rumbustion.
Both of which mean tumult or uproar.
A very fitting name for a spirit known for causing trouble.
The origins are traced to Barbados around 1650, and the spirit was discovered out of, well, necessity or maybe desperation by the enslaved population there.
Yes. Plantation slaves discovered that molasses, that dark, thick, sweet byproduct left over after you refined sugarcane into crystals, could be fermented and then distilled.
And initially, this stuff was incredibly harsh.
Incredibly. And tragically, plantation owners weaponized it. They used the potent drink to subdue and control the enslaved population.
And the entire industry really hinges on sugarcane itself. Can you give us the quick timeline on that key ingredient?
Sure. Sugarcane originated in New Guinea, maybe 8,000 years ago. It slowly moved west, eventually reaching the Americas with Spanish and Portuguese colonists in the late 1490s. The climate was perfect. Sugar plantations just exploded across the Caribbean and Brazil.
And massive sugar production meant massive molasses waste.
And where there's cheap, abundant sugar, there is the potential for cheap, abundant alcohol. The immense growth of the sugar plantations in the 16th and 17th centuries created just vast quantities of the raw material, setting the stage for rum to become a global commodity.
And as that trade grew, rum solidified its link with naval power. The British Royal Navy adopted rum in 1687, replacing their traditional ration of French brandy.
This is a purely practical decision. It was all about logistics and preservation. Beer barrels took up huge amounts of space, and the beer often spoiled on long voyages. Rum, being a high-proof spirit, didn't spoil and was highly concentrated.
And it was essential for boosting morale and ensuring compliance among the sailors.
Well, absolutely, which gave rise to the legendary concept of Nelson's blood.
It's one of history's most gruesome and memorable legends.
It really is. When Lord Nelson was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, his body needed to be preserved to get it back to England. So they placed him in a cask of rum.
And the legend says that when they arrived, they discovered the sailors had gotten bored on the long journey.
had drilled holes in the cask and drank the rum, leaving only Nelson's body behind.
Hence the nickname for rum among sailors, Nelson's Blood. It's not clear if the story is 100% true, but it definitely illustrates how much they valued that spirit.
Rum then quickly moved from the sea to the American colonies, where it became America's first commercially produced spirit. The first distillery opened on Staten Island in 1664.
And the American colonies weren't just drinking it, they were basing their entire trade economy on it. By the time of the Revolution, they were consuming vast quantities per person, and New England rum was their most successful export.
Yeah, sometimes making up 80% of their entire trade activity. And this massive commercial success was powered by the horrific engine of the triangular trade.
Let's just detail that cycle again, because it shows how completely intertwined rum was with exploitation.
Okay, so
Yeah.
molasses from the Caribbean goes to New England. It gets distilled into rum. That rum is then shipped to West Africa and exchanged for enslaved people.
And those people were then brutally transported back to the Caribbean sugar plantations to produce more molasses.
It was a self-perpetuating system built on unimaginable human suffering. The figures are just devastating. Up to 30% of the enslaved people died during the Middle Passage across the Atlantic.
Eventually, this incredibly profitable colonial rum trade, which relied on cheaper foreign molasses, really angered the British authorities.
Right, they wanted to protect their own Caribbean sugar interest. So they cracked down, first with the Molasses Act of 1733, and then the much harsher Sugar Act of 1764. These acts imposed steep taxes on any foreign molasses coming into the American colonies.
But the colonists successfully resisted this tax, partly through bribery, partly through boycotting, and this is where that famous anecdote comes from.
John Adams. He noted that the revolutionaries met constantly in taverns and distilleries, fueling their dissent with rum punch.
Which led to the profound observation that the real spirit of 1776 wasn't necessarily the tea dumped in Boston Harbor, but the rum that fueled those revolutionary meetings.
The economic pressure from the Sugar Act was absolutely one of the critical catalysts for the American Revolution.
Fast forward into the 19th century, American whiskey takes center stage, but rum continues to evolve, largely thanks to technological improvements in distillation.
The major leap forward was the column still, patented by Aeneas Coffey in 1831. Traditional pot stills produce spirits slowly, and they retain a lot of flavor, or congeners. The column still allowed for continuous distillation.
And continuous distillation meant what for the final product?
To produce spirits much faster, and, crucially, at a much higher proof. And because the spirit was purer, higher in ethanol, lower in those congeners, it created the lighter, cleaner, drier rums we associate with producers like Bacardi in Cuba, who adopted the column still in 1889.
Then came the American Prohibition era, and that was an unexpected boost for Cuban rum.
A massive boom. American drinkers and bartenders just moved their operations 90 miles south. They flocked to Havana, and for those staying home, illegal consumption just soared.
And that era gave us two enduring terms: rum runners, the smugglers,
And the real McCoy.
named after the smuggler William McCoy.
Yes. McCoy was famous for providing high-quality, unadulterated, branded rum to his clients. He set himself apart from the others, who often diluted or doctored their product. When customers said they wanted the real McCoy, they were demanding quality contraband.
And finally, after World War II, rum saw this massive cultural shift in the U.S., largely thanks to returning servicemen.
Yeah, those servicemen, returning from the Pacific Theater, brought home a taste for rum, and those exotic, complex, tiki-style drinks popularized by guys like Trader Vic, Don the Beachcomber. Rum successfully transitioned from a rough maritime staple to the foundation of sophisticated tropical cocktails, completing its global transformation.
All right, now we cast a wider net to explore the unique production stories of some other global varieties, moving into the Americas with tequila.
Tequila is one of the most geographically and botanically specific spirits there is. It has to be distilled exclusively from the blue agave plant, specifically Agave tequilana Weber Blue.
And that requirement is what legally separates it from mezcal.
Right. Mezcal can be made from over 30 different species of agave. Tequila, only one.
And before distillation was even introduced, the indigenous populations of central Mexico had been consuming a fermented agave beverage for centuries. Pulque.
The history of distillation in Mexico is a perfect fusion of indigenous resources and Spanish technique. The distilled spirit began in the 16th century when the Spanish conquistadors, having run out of their own European brandy,
Started distilling the local agave.
they applied their imported distillation knowledge to what was available. Necessity, once again, is the mother of invention in spirits.
So the process starts with the agave plant itself, which takes years to mature.
Decades sometimes. A blue agave takes 8 to 12 years to reach maturity. They harvest the core, the heart of the plant, called the piña, and then traditionally those piñas are roasted.
This roasting is key to the flavor, isn't it? It makes it so different from a grain spirit.
Absolutely. The massive starchy piñas are slowly roasted, sometimes in traditional brick ovens, sometimes in modern autoclaves, to convert the complex carbohydrates into fermentable sugars. This low, slow heat adds notes of caramel, smoke, and cooked vegetable to the resulting liquid.
The flavor complexity in the final spirit is just staggering. It's not just a base alcohol.
No, it contains over 300 known compounds, higher-order alcohols, esters, terpenes, and what's fascinating scientifically is the role of time in the fermentation.
What happens when they slow that process down?
Well, the concentration of those volatile organoleptic compounds, the ones responsible for the distinctive aroma and flavor profiles, it actually increases when the fermentation process is deliberately slowed down.
So faster fermentation gives you simple, sharp flavors. Slow, cool fermentation gives you complexity.
Exactly. And tequila, just like Scotch and bourbon, has classifications based on aging. Blanco or silver tequila is finished right after distillation, so it keeps those sharp agave notes.
And others, like reposado or añejo, spend time in oak barrels, which rounds out the flavor and introduces those vanilla and spice notes we talked about with whiskeys.
From the arid roasted deserts of Mexico, we jump across the Atlantic to the tightly controlled chilly vineyards of France to talk about the famous fizz, champagne.
To be called champagne, it's so much more than just a sparkling wine. It has to be produced exclusively in the Champagne region, following incredibly strict rules, primarily using Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay grapes.
And the secret isn't just the grape, it's the specific method of creating that carbonation.
The traditional method.
The traditional method, which used to be called method champenoise. It involves making a still-base wine, bottling it, and then inducing a secondary alcoholic fermentation inside the sealed bottle.
How do they start that second fermentation?
They add a blend of yeast and rock sugar called the liqueur de tirage. The yeast consumes the sugar, producing a tiny bit more alcohol and, crucially, carbon dioxide. And because the bottle is sealed, that CO2 dissolves into the wine under immense pressure, creating the famous bubbles.
And this fermentation process is what gives champagne those wonderful, toasty, brioche-like flavors.
Yes, that is due to a process called autolysis. After the secondary fermentation is done, the yeast cells die and break down. This dead yeast, the lees, remains in contact with the wine, releasing compounds that contribute those complex, bready, nutty notes that define great champagne.
But the dead yeast sediment is still in the bottle. How do they get the liquid perfectly clear?
That is where the ingenious steps of riddling and disgorging come in. Riddling, or remuge, involves gradually moving the bottle from horizontal to an inverted vertical position.
Forcing all that sediment down into the neck of the bottle.
Exactly. And once it's all in the neck, they freeze the neck of the bottle in a brine solution. When they pop the cap, the degorgement process, the pressure inside the bottle forcibly ejects that frozen plug of sediment, leaving perfectly clear wine behind.
That is an amazing combination of physics and patience. And those beautiful streams of bubbles we see, they don't just form randomly either.
No, they need a starting point. The continuous bubbles form on microscopic imperfections or etchings in the glass, sometimes put there on purpose by the manufacturer. These tiny flaws facilitate nucleation, giving the dissolved CO2 a place to escape.
And the method itself, while we strongly associate it with France, was actually developed somewhere else first, wasn't it?
Surprisingly, yes. Records from the Royal Society in London show that the technique of adding sugar and yeast to a sealed bottle to induce a stable secondary fermentation was developed in England in 1662, years before it became standard in champagne.
What's also fun to look back on is how drastically champagne's desired sweetness has changed over time. It's a perfect illustration of changing global tastes.
Oh, absolutely. Today, most people prefer brut or extra brut, which are very dry. But historically, the sweetness level, the dosage, varied wildly by market.
Give us an example of an extreme.
The Russian taste in the 19th century demanded champagne with up to 300 grams of sugar per liter.
300, that's insanely sweet. It's basically a sugary syrup.
Compared to the English taste of the same era, which was the driest on the market, much closer to our modern preference. It just shows that alcohol isn't just science, it's a living reflection of cultural preference.
Okay, finally, let's briefly touch on vodka, a spirit defined by its purity and its deep historical role in Eastern European economies.
The name itself comes directly from the Russian word voda, which means Water. The origin is heavily disputed. Russia, Poland, Sweden all lay claim to it, but the production is fairly consistent. It's mostly made from grain or potatoes.
What's fascinating here is its extreme historical and economic significance in Russia.
It was so vital to the national finances that the government often maintained a state monopoly on production and sale. And this monopoly went beyond simple taxation.
How so?
The state control ensured immense revenues that funded everything from wars to infrastructure. Vodka was so culturally and economically vital that it was sometimes used as a form of currency or an item of trade right up until the end of the Soviet era.
And because it's often distilled so many times to achieve that neutrality, what steps do they take to ensure that purity?
Modern production relies heavily on filtration. While historical methods used crude filters, today you see producers using massive charcoal filters or even filters made of quartz, platinum, or diamond dust
All just to strip out every last vestige of flavor and impurities.
to achieve that perfect neutrality. But back in the Middle Ages, they began flavoring vodkas not for fun, but for utility,
Right. They needed to mask the harsh, impure tastes that came from their primitive distillation equipment.
which led to classics like limonaya, flavored with lemon zest, or pertsovka, using chili peppers. Adding botanicals back then was actually a sign of technological weakness, not strength.
And we have a great cultural nickname for vodka, Zelionizmai.
The Russian nickname, the green serpent. It's so evocative. It references both the visual aspect, the coiled distillation pipes used to make the spirit, and the less pleasant cultural aspect, the hallucinations and visions associated with severe chronic drunkenness.
We've traveled from ancient staples to global commodities. Now we're taking the final border crossing, the one inside your skull. Let's talk about the neurobiology of the buzz.
This is where that historical quest for the aqua vitae really meets modern science. Alcohol's effects are acute, meaning they're immediate, and they stem entirely from its interaction with several crucial neurotransmitter systems in the brain.
So when we talk about how the brain works, we're talking about chemical signals being sent between neurons, and alcohol just throws a wrench into that whole process.
It really does. We primarily look at four pathways involved: dopaminergic, serotoninergic, GABA, and glutamate. The dopaminergic system, for instance, that's the reward circuit. It's why drinking can initially feel so pleasurable.
And the serotoninergic system is involved in mood, sleep, and critically, impulsivity.
Exactly. Changes in serotonin levels are strongly linked to increased impulsivity and specific alcohol drinking behaviors.
But let's focus on the two big players that govern excitement and inhibition, GABA and glutamate. This is really where the feeling of being drunk originates.
Think of the brain's activity like driving a car. You have a brake pedal and a gas pedal. GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It is the brain's brake pedal. It calms everything down.
So when alcohol hits the GABA receptors, what happens?
Alcohol enhances GABA's effectiveness. It basically pushes the brake pedal down harder. This is why you feel sedated, relaxed, why your inhibitions drop, your brain's stop signals are amplified.
And then you have glutamate. If GABA is the brake, what's glutamate?
Glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. It is the gas pedal. It speeds up activity. And alcohol actively interferes with glutamate receptors, specifically the NMDA receptors. It essentially lifts your foot off the gas.
So you're pressing the brake hard and simultaneously easing off the gas. The result is just severely reduced cognitive function, slower reaction times, intoxication.
And if we connect this to the bigger, darker picture of chronic exposure, this constant chemical manipulation is what leads to physical dependence.
How does the brain adapt to this constant interference?
Well, the brain always strives for equilibrium. If you constantly flood the system with something that enhances the brake and reduces the gas, the brain fights back. It decreases the sensitivity of GABA receptors and increases the sensitivity and number of glutamate receptors.
So the brain is essentially trying to keep the car moving at normal speed, forcing you to consume more alcohol just to feel normal.
Precisely. And this creates a severe imbalance. When alcohol is suddenly removed during withdrawal, the GABA brake is weak, but that glutamate gas pedal is fully pressed to the floor.
And that overwhelming excitatory imbalance is what causes the extreme anxiety, tremors, seizures, all the terrible states associated with severe alcohol withdrawal.
Let's move to a more immediate consequence.
Yeah.
The hangover. There are so many myths about cures, but scientifically, what is actually happening when you wake up feeling terrible?
Those miserable symptoms, the fatigue, nausea, headache, they don't happen while the alcohol is actively in your system. They begin after the alcohol has left your bloodstream.
Right, usually when your blood alcohol concentration gets back to near zero. And people often cite dehydration, but that's not the only factor.
No, dehydration is a massive part of it because alcohol is a diuretic. But we also have to deal with congeners, those impurities from fermentation, which can be minor toxins, and the immune system's inflammatory response to the whole ordeal.
So darker drinks like red wine or bourbon, they tend to have more congeners than clear spirits like vodka, which could potentially worsen the hangover.
What about the classic idea of vomiting to get it out?
Largely ineffective and actually counterproductive if more than 30 minutes have passed since your last drink. The alcohol is already in your bloodstream. Vomiting just makes the dehydration and electrolyte loss way worse.
So what's the best strategy for prevention?
The boring effective one. Eat before and during drinking. Food, a mix of carbs, protein, and fat, slows the rate at which alcohol is absorbed. It stabilizes your blood sugar and gives your body a chance to process everything over a longer time.
Okay, now, on to a classic piece of cultural science. The beer goggles effect. The idea that intoxication lowers inhibitions, making people appear more attractive. Is this just cultural lore?
Studies suggest the effect is real, though it's complex. Older studies, like one in 2003 with college students, showed that those who drank alcohol rated a higher number of people as attractive compared to their sober counterparts.
And we even have evidence in the non-human world, which is hilarious.
The 2008 Penn State fruit fly study is a scientific gem. Male fruit flies, after consuming alcohol, were significantly less selective and less picky about potential female mates. They literally experienced the beer goggles effect on a biological level.
However, a 2013 French study introduced a fascinating psychological caveat. It suggested that what you believe might be as powerful as the buzz itself.
Yeah, participants were given either alcohol or a placebo, but some were actively told they had received alcohol even if they hadn't. And those who thought they had consumed alcohol, even when they were sober, rated their own attractiveness and humor higher than the sober control groups.
So the expectation of being funnier or more charming because you're drunk might be driving some of the perceived effects. That raises a great question. Is the confidence coming from the booze or the belief in the booze?
It's definitely a complex interplay, but that psychological component is undeniable.
Finally, let's wrap up with a quick tour of some quirky liquor laws. These often reflect historical incidents or just bizarre attempts by governments to control the chaos that alcohol can sometimes create.
These laws are wonderful historical artifacts, often just left on the books long after the incident that inspired them has passed into legend.
My favorite comes from Alaska. It is explicitly illegal to serve alcoholic beverages to a moose.
Why on earth would that law exist? Because authorities in places like Sweden and Alaska have actually had to deal with severely drunk moose.
What?
The animals gorge themselves on fermented apples that have fallen from trees, they get intoxicated, and sometimes they get stuck in fences or trees. It's a massive public safety and animal welfare hazard.
You do not want a massive, angry, drunk herbivore near your home.
Alaska also have this bizarre exception to the legal drinking age of 21. A minor can consume alcohol if it's supplied by a parent, legal guardian, or unbelievably their spouse.
The marriage loophole exists.
It does. Then you have the temperature police in Oklahoma, where it's illegal to sell refrigerated beer above a certain proof.
So if the beer is too strong, it has to be sold warm.
Yeah. If you want that cold IPA, you have to buy it at room temperature and chill it yourself. The rule is based on older laws that categorize high point beer differently.
And then we have Kentucky, the absolute epicenter of American bourbon, yet it still struggles with these old Prohibition-era legacy laws.
Large parts of Kentucky are still legally designated as moist or outright dry counties. But history created an interesting loophole. Qualified historic sites can get special licenses to sell alcohol if they have a historic relationship to the product,
Effectively allowing taverns and distilleries to operate legally even in dry areas. It's a great example of history providing an exemption to the law.
And to close our legal tour, let's look at England. The UK's 1872 Licensing Act is fascinatingly strict. According to the letter of the law, simply being drunk at a pub is enough to get you a fine.
You don't have to be disorderly or loud or causing trouble. Just the state of intoxication is an offense.
Yeah, a law that sounds incredibly difficult to enforce on a busy Friday night, but a fine example of legislative attempts to regulate social life.
So what does this all mean? Our deep dive has taken us on a journey that stretches across millennia, linking purification, trade, and science.
We started with medieval alchemists who, in their pursuit of medicine and eternal life, distilled wine into aqua vitae. Then we saw that purified spirit get hijacked by global trade, driving the horrific economic engine of the triangular trade that made rum a commodity.
We observed how scientific accidents like that French wine blight that drove Scottish distillers to use surplus sherry casks inadvertently created the multi-billion-dollar tradition of Scotch aging.
And we've reviewed the complex neurobiology that governs the buzz, showing how alcohol actively manipulates the brain's braking and gas pedals.
Every single glass we've discussed holds centuries of scientific development, geopolitical conflict, and cultural adaptation. The evolution of alcohol is a reflection of humanity's deepest urges, from the pursuit of medicine and currency to just the simple desire for merriment.
For our final provocative thought, we want to expand on that idea we touched on earlier, the concept that really defines premium wine: terroir.
Terroir refers to the complete ecosystem, the unique interaction between the soil, the climate, the topography, the specific vine that gives a wine its distinctive characteristics. We know that soil factors, like water and nitrogen, profoundly influence the grape's composition, impacting its final aromatic compounds.
But if that unique environmental fingerprint of the earth, the terroir, is so critical to a grape, how does that principle extend into the world of distilled spirits?
Think about the blue agave for tequila, or the specific strains of corn and barley used in bourbon and scotch. These base materials are products of their unique environmental starting points.
So even though distillation purifies the liquid to a very high degree, and aging in barrels introduces massive new flavor layers, the foundation is still the grain or the plant. Does the character conserved by the soil, the water, and the climate, the terroir, impart a fundamental flavor profile to the raw spirit that no amount of purification can ever fully erase?
It suggests that even the water of life might still retain the memory of the earth it sprang from, a ghost of its origin that influences the final taste. Something to mull over the next time you pour a dram or pop a cork.